I'm going to introduce, first of all, Colleen Brown. She is a PhD student. This is a joint presentation, by the way. Colleen Brown is a PhD student in Applied Coastal and Ocean Sciences at UCW, studying water quality of the Cape Fear River Basin, and is a research scientist with the Lower Cape Fear River Program. And all that is her background, but she is an amazing rock star of a human as well. I'm so happy she's here. And she'll be sharing the stage with Dr. Detlef Knappe. Detlef is the S. James Allen Distinguished Professor of Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering at NC State. Detlef's research interests broadly encompass drinking water quality and treatment, and he has conducted research on per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, aka PFAS, since 2010. And Detlef is also the researcher who broke the PFAS story. If you did not know that, he's the one who gave that story to the press. That's the reason we know it exists. Big deal. I'd welcome you both up to the stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dana. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Colleen. I'll be kicking off the presentation here today. We will be talking about the long-term water quality trends in the Cape Fear River Basin. But before getting into the data, I want to do a brief overview of our watershed and the potential impacts to water quality. Kemp already gave an amazing overview of this, but I'm going to really drive this home. These are important points here. So let's see the pointer. Here we go. Okay. So this map here shows the Cape Fear River Basin, and it's the largest watershed in North Carolina. And a watershed is basically any area that receives water and drains to a common outlet, which in our case here is the Atlantic Ocean. And the Cape Fear River actually starts up here in the Piedmont area, just to the southwest of Raleigh, and then it's at the convergence of the hot and the deep river basins, and it will flow down into the coastal plain where it then merges with the Black River here and the Northeast Cape Fear River just north of Wilmington. And then it enters the main stem in the estuary area right outside our windows here, and then flows down to the Atlantic Ocean out near Southport. And it's important to remember when talking about watersheds that what's upstream must flow downstream at some point. And the basin is home to about 2 million people, and it's the most heavily industrialized watershed in North Carolina. The Lower Cape Fear River Basin, shown in the light blue to the right here, is of particular interest because it has been named as one of the most vulnerable to nutrient pollution in the United States. And highlighted here are some of the major industries and urbanized areas in our watershed, which are important to consider when studying water quality because they're sources of pollution here. We have the growing cities of Fayetteville and Wilmington, as well as the Port of Wilmington here. And those cities have wastewater treatment plants, major ones, and we also use the river for sourcing our drinking water. And there's also the commercial industries like Chemours and International Paper, which are point source dischargers because they generate wastewater that is then discharged directly back into the river. And the map here shows the permitted point source dischargers in our basin here. And these point source dischargers can be from areas like sewage treatment plants, industrial and animal agriculture facilities, and also the stormwater drainage systems. Each facility has a permit that sets limits on the concentrations of pollutants that are allowed back in the wastewater and into the river. And the main stem of the Cape Fear River here, down here may be hard for you in the back to see, sorry about this, but down by Wilmington, we have one of the highest concentrations of the point source discharges in the watershed. One of the major point source dischargers are the poultry and swine CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations, which are highlighted on the map here, each of these dots, and then this is a heat map showing the concentrations of them. And the lower Cape Fear River watershed, highlighted in yellow, has the one of the highest concentrations of CAFOs, not in the United States, but in the world. And each of these facilities produces a ton of waste, and it's been contributing to nutrient pollution in our watershed for decades. But one of the best ways to track pollution is through long-term water quality monitoring. And we're lucky here in Wilmington that we have our own program called the Lower Cape Fear River Program. And it's an incredible wealth of data that's publicly available on the health of our waters, spanning almost 30 years now. It started in 1995, which was before I was even born. And the program was developed by a very collaborative group of people from all different sectors, including UNCW, Cape Fear Community College, NCDEQ, the Division of Marine Fisheries, USGS, the Army Corps of Engineers, Agriculture and Forestry Services, NC Extension, and our lovely hosts here today, Cape Fear River Watch. And this is the website link if you would like to check it out and see our data sets that we have, environmental assessment reports. It's lcfrp.org. And the monitoring program includes monthly water quality sampling at 32 sites shown on this map, and they're located throughout the Black River, the Northeast Cape Fear River, the main stem of the Cape Fear River, into the estuary here. And this effort is led by our team at the Aquatic Ecology Lab at UNCW, some of which are in the back here. And this is headed by Dr. Mike Mallon and our lab manager, Matthew McKeever, who are large contributors to the data that I'm going to be showing today. None of this would be possible without them. So each of these stations is dedicated for a certain reason because it's located to a particular area. So for example, Collie Creek, which is here, it's a near pristine swamp location that we've considered our control site. We also have near Highway NC11 that is below Lock and Dam 1 and represents our drinking water imports. We also have stations that are located at the lower end of point source discharge area. So this is below International Paper by Acme. And also in the top area, the northern portion of the Northeast Cape Fear River at the headwaters, we have stations that represent point source pollution discharge areas that also are in watersheds with tons of CAFOs and regular agriculture. So we have a little bit of everything throughout here. And here's a little video that I want to show you guys of us having a lot of fun sampling, because this is more fun to see with a video. So we're cruising along. We're in the RV Sturgeon. We're going out to take water quality samples. And as we're nearing, here we are at right under Highway 11, we're taking surface water samples. And these will be analyzed back in the lab for nutrients, fecal bacteria, chlorophyll, and also TSS. We also take in situ measurements using data sonde off the back, and we will record all of that. Those are physical parameters like water temperature, pH, DO, and all these samples are state certified, and the state is submitted to the EPA. So here we see it again. The beautiful and lovely drone shots are taken by JT Fritsch. So using the program's data, we were able to determine how the water quality has changed over the past 20 years. We took statistical analyses of the monthly data from 2000 to 2019, and what we got were linear regressions that looked like this figure here. And instead of showing you the over 100 plots that we got them for each parameter at each station. So instead of going through 100 plots, I'm going to show you the summarized trends at the watershed scale with nice colors and figures like this. So looking at the Black River stations first, what we saw is that there was at 100% of the stations significant increases in nitrate and fecal coliform bacteria over the 20 years. So nitrate is a form of inorganic nitrogen that can come from human and animal waste as well as fertilizers. And fecal coliform bacteria, why we look at this is because this is a bacteria that lives in our digestive tracts and also that of animals and birds, and indicates the presence of both human and animal waste in our waters. And a lot of these concentrations of fecal coliform throughout here, they frequently are above the standard for that's deemed safe for human contact. So a lot of these waters are extremely impaired. And we also see an increase in total phosphorus at almost all the stations except for the South River up here. And total phosphorus, that's looking at both the inorganic and organic forms of phosphorus. And phosphorus, the inorganic forms can come from commercial fertilizers or also sewage. Next, looking at the Northeast Cape Fear River here, we see is that there's also significant increases in fecal coliform. This is at 67% of the stations. We also had nitrate increases at more than half of the stations, and total nitrogen increased at 33% of the stations. This was at Highway NC 403, Little Rockfish Creek, and Rockfish Creek. And these are the three troublemakers. We have seen an increase in almost everything at these three stations. And there were also increases in total phosphorus at more than half of the stations. And we saw a mixed bag with orthophosphate. So the orthophosphate is, again, that inorganic phosphorus, and that comes from commercial fertilizers and sewage. And we see an increase at 4 stations, but actually a decrease in these 2 stations here. So overall, what we're seeing in the Northeast and the Black River is persistent and increasing nutrient and bacteria pollution over time, over this 20-year period. And what we expect this to be from is likely CAFOs. So this map here shows the concentration of CAFOs in relation to each of the stations. So you can see up here the Northeast Cape Fear River stations and the Black River are in these really dense CAFO areas. Some of these watersheds drain an area that has hundreds of CAFOs. One has like 165 swine CAFOs. And this is mainly the data that you're seeing here is from swine CAFOs. It's not necessarily poultry. There's only a few locations that are permitted and on here, but we know that poultry CAFOs are really increasing in these areas as well. And just to highlight here, we'll get into the main stem of the Cape Fear River next, but Browns and Hammonds Creeks here in the Cape Fear River also have a high concentration of CAFOs. We don't really see many CAFOs in the lower Cape Fear River and into the estuary. So what we're all here to talk about, the Cape Fear River. So in the main stem, we're seeing 90% increase. So 8 out of the 9 stations that we analyzed for trends of fecal bacteria were increasing over time. We didn't look at, we don't have 20-year trends for the estuary area because in 2011 we switched to a different sampling method, so we didn't have the 20-year trends here. But for example, Browns Creek up here, this actually had a 200-fold increase in the fecal bacteria. So this is consistently above what is safe for human contact. But we're not seeing that at all these stations over time, but they do frequently go above this. So a lot of these stations are frequently unsafe for human contact. So why would fecal coliforms be on the rise here? So one of the potentials is that this is one of the highest point source pollution in inundated waterways here, as I was saying before, and also population increased in the Cape Fear River Basin. So just the Cape Fear River Basin, not the Black or the Northeast. What we see is that since 2000, there's been an increase of 500,000 people here. So that could be contributing to it as well. And in addition to fecal bacteria, we also saw increases in nitrate and total nitrogen. And these are at, again, these troublesome sites here, Browns Creek and Hammonds Creek. But if you notice, we're not seeing the same increase in nitrogen down into the lower portions of the main stem and into the estuary. And this may be because this area is very well flushed. The main stem of the estuary has a residency time of about 7 days, so it's flushed approximately every week. And what we see also is that we have a large decrease in orthophosphate at the majority of the stations, but the ones that did not have a decrease in orthophosphate actually increased in total phosphorus. And these are these sites at the lower portion of the estuary, right at the mouth here. They had an increase in total phosphorus over time, which was really interesting. It's unclear why there was such a widespread decrease in this orthophosphate, but we are thinking that has something to do with the point source discharge areas. This is highly permitted here, so it seems like they are adhering to the regulations that are in place here. They're adhering to those pollution regulations, which is positive. We're seeing a good thing right there, at least in terms of orthophosphate. So to wrap all this up, the key takeaways for all of this is that the 20-year analysis of the Lower Cape Fear River program data showed that fecal bacteria concentrations had the most widespread increases throughout the entire Cape Fear River basin. And nutrient pollution is on the rise, but concentrated mainly in the Black and the Northeast Cape Fear Rivers, and is related to the abundance of CAFOs in this area. And we're not really seeing that same nutrient increases downstream along the 20-year time span. We do see pulses of this. It is impacting the lower portions of the river. And the main stem of the Cape Fear River is showing small but significant increases in fecal bacteria at the majority of the stations, and also increased nitrogen concentrations upstream, which is due to CAFOs there. But we do see these decreasing orthophosphate concentrations. And that's it from my portion of it, and I will pass the baton to...
And before you get started, Detlef, I just want to make a comment. We'll hold questions for both at the end. Thank you.
Great. All right, so I'm going to shift gears to more man-made chemicals. So I'll talk about 3 types of unregulated contaminants, or mostly unregulated contaminants: PFAS, 1,4-dioxane, and bromide. And so for PFAS, for those of you who haven't heard about this term, it's a class of thousands of chemicals, and we worry about PFAS because many of them are persistent in the environment. They are often called also forever chemicals. There are chemicals that accumulate in the human body. So we talk about half-lives, the time that it takes to eliminate half of what you take in. So for some of the PFAS, the human half-life is on the order of years. So if I take in a certain amount of PFAS today, for PFOS, 5 years from now, I have half of that still in me. So it's very easy to see that these chemicals can accumulate if we take in some of those every day. And apart from being bioaccumulative, they have toxic properties. They're immunotoxicants. They're toxic to the liver. Some are carcinogenic. And also, these chemicals are very mobile, so we see them really already all over the globe, even in very remote areas. So where do PFAS get used, and how do they end up in the environment? They're produced at fluorochemical manufacturing sites like the Chemours facility that Colleen showed on her map near Fayetteville. When these chemicals are made, wastewater is produced, air emissions are produced, and that's where chemicals can enter the environment. But then these chemicals find their way into lots of consumer products, and so also during the life cycle of these consumer products, from manufacture through use through disposal at the end of life, PFAS can enter the environment. So we're also exposed directly to PFAS through things like food contact material. So if you look at all these different things, so Teflon pan is in and of itself reasonably safe to use, but the production of a Teflon pan is very dirty business. Food contact materials, they get into contact with the food we eat, so there's transfer of PFAS to the food, and then we ingest the PFAS that way. If you are happy to purchase lots of outdoor gear, unfortunately, a lot of outdoor gear contains PFAS to make it water repellent, so any Gore-Tex products and things like that, again, are reasonably safe to use, but the production and disposal of those materials is problematic. Also, stain treatments, things like that contain PFAS, and then also firefighting foams have been an important source of PFAS into the environment. So, since we're talking about longer term trends, I just wanted to show this timeline here. The facility near Fayetteville initially was a DuPont plant, so we generically refer to it as Fayetteville Works. From 1980 until 2015, it was operated by DuPont, and then DuPont spun it off to Chemours, which is now the owner of that fluorochemical production facility. In 1980, fluorochemical production started at this site, and I would say until 2002, almost nobody paid much attention to it because they were making chemicals that were completely unregulated. And in 2002, the facility started making PFOA, a particular chemical that had raised already concerns in terms of adverse health effects. And if you haven't seen the movie Dark Waters with Mark Ruffalo, please go do so. It really tells the story of PFOA very well. Moving PFOA production to Fayetteville Works really created some first concerns about this facility. As a result, EPA researchers in Research Triangle Park conducted a study to look at, does this facility actually emit PFOA? Interestingly enough, that 2007 study actually found that PFOA was prevalent throughout the entire Cape Fear River Basin, including the Haw River, and some of the highest PFOA levels were actually well upstream of Fayetteville Works. So that indicated there were really lots of other PFAS sources besides just Fayetteville Works. In 2009, EPA first started thinking about regulating PFAS and issued provisional health advisory levels at the time at 200 and 400 nanograms per liter for PFOA and PFOS. Those levels look incredibly high nowadays. In March of this year, EPA proposed drinking water standards for PFOA and PFOS at 4 nanograms per liter. Also in 2009, DuPont decided to phase out the use of PFOA and replace PFOA with Gen X, and so EPA permitted DuPont to manufacture Gen X under specific conditions. Between 2012 and 2015, I got involved in studying PFAS. I worked together a lot with Mark Streiner and Andy Lindstrom at US EPA, and during this time period, we were curious, if Gen X is now a replacement for PFOA, is Gen X showing up in the water? And sure enough, we quickly found it in 2012 in the water, in 2014 in Wilmington drinking water. In 2015, Mark Streiner actually published a paper showing the structures of many other unknown PFAS up to that point, apart from Gen X. And then in 2016, two things happened. EPA issued a health advisory level for PFOA and PFOS at 70 nanograms per liter, so ratcheting the values down from the 200 and 400. And then we published a paper that really highlighted the importance of Gen X and some of these other fluorochemicals in the Cape Fear River Basin. And a key finding was that in Wilmington, Gen X was found both in the raw water at the drinking water intake, as well as in the finished water, which passed through a fairly advanced drinking water treatment plant that contained ozonation, UV disinfection, biofiltration. So very, very state-of-the-art facility, but not equipped to remove PFAS. The other thing that was really important was that, you see, this green bar was the only chemical that the Cape Fear Public Utility Authority found in their water when PFAS monitoring first was conducted as part of an EPA regulation called the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule. So that green sliver was about 27 nanograms per liter, and so the utility really thought PFAS wasn't a problem in Wilmington. Well, when you look at the Gen X bar, you can see that the levels of Gen X were very high, but the methods at the time, the standard methods, were not targeting that particular chemical, so it was flying below the radar. EPA in March of this year is basically provided a health advisory level for Gen X at 10 nanograms per liter. The levels here are over 400 nanograms per liter, so well over 40 times what is currently deemed as acceptable. Besides Gen X, which now is just shown in this little red sliver on the left, there were a lot of other PFAS in the water for which we could not actually tell people what the concentrations were because we lacked calibration standards for them. But this mass spectrometer response is proportional to how much is in the water, so the bigger the bar, the more is there. And so it was clear to us that besides Gen X, there were lots of other PFAS in the water, and that was really one of the biggest concerns for us. So, we published this paper in 2016. We couldn't figure out at the time what the concentration of some of these PFAS were. So we looked at an archived sample a couple years later for these perfluorocarboxylic acids that are commonly measured in water. The levels in this 2015 samples were about 120 nanograms per liter. The sulfonic acids about 45 nanograms per liter. But these fluor ethers that were unknown prior to these investigations were over 100,000 nanograms per liter. So very, very high concentrations that were basically discharged into the river over a 37-year period prior to their discovery. So we published the paper in 2016, but the public really didn't learn about this until the newspaper article written by Vaughn Haggerty came out almost exactly 6 years ago. And that created truly a public outcry and also put a lot of pressure on the regulators to do something about this pollution. And within a few days, representatives from Chemours came to town, and among other things, they admitted that they had actually discharged Gen X and the other fluor ethers into the water since 1980, because Gen X was not just manufactured on purpose since 2009, but it was also a byproduct of fluorochemical production since the very beginning in 1980. The other thing that came out during that meeting was that the company agreed to collect wastewater from their processes. They shipped that water to Texas for deep well injection. And so we tracked PFAS levels in the Cape Fear River at that time. And so this was just before the wastewater, processed wastewaters were collected. And then within a few months, the PFAS really did, levels decreased dramatically and flushed out of the river. it looks very impressive, and this looks apparently low, but even that reasonably small bar has very high levels of PFAS, all things considered, still hundreds of nanograms per liter, which is high compared to what is considered acceptable now. So in 2017, also the Gen X exposure study was funded, and so we were interested in tracking PFAS levels, not just in the water, but also in people. And so we wanted to see, are these PFAS measurable in our bodies? And what did this intervention now, the decreasing levels of PFAS in the river, mean to the PFAS levels in people? So these are some esoteric-looking chemical names, but these are all fluor ethers that were emitted through processed wastewater by the Chemours and DuPont facility, the Fayetteville Works facility. And these percentages are the frequency at which we detected these chemicals in people here in Wilmington. Initially, there were 344 people who participated in this study. And so basically, these chemicals were present in essentially everybody that participated. And so the somewhat good news part of the intervention that the PFAS levels in the drinking water have decreased is that the levels of these PFAS that we found in almost everybody here in Wilmington in people's blood are now also decreasing. So this shows, drinking water was an important source of exposure, and the intervention has really led to a decrease of the body burden associated with the exposure. But the question remains, prior to 2017, between 1980 and 2017, what were the levels, and what are the health effects associated with this very long exposure? So I'll come back to PFAS at the very end, but let me talk a little bit about 1,4-dioxane. So this is a chemical that's also very persistent. It is, again, often introduced into the environment as a result of a byproduct that is produced during manufacturing of things like detergents, shampoos, certain types of plastics. And it's a likely human carcinogen by all routes of exposure, so drinking, inhaling, dermal contact. So we've been tracking 1,4-dioxane also since about 2012, and we see that through the entire Cape Fear River Basin, especially in the upper reaches of the basin, 1,4-dioxane levels are very high. They're decreasing somewhat as you go downstream. That means a lot of the sources are in this upper region of the watershed, and fewer sources are in the lower region of the watershed, leading to basically dilution of what was put in further upstream. The 1 in a million cancer risk level for 1,4-dioxane is 0.35 micrograms per liter. So that's really our benchmark. So we consider a level of 0.35 micrograms per liter and below acceptable from a drinking water consumption perspective. Anything above that is considered, an elevated risk. So, through our monitoring efforts, we highlighted 3 sources of 1,4-dioxane. We basically looked at wastewater discharges, and we sampled upstream and downstream of each of these wastewater discharges. And when the concentration of 1,4-dioxane went up in the river, then we knew this is a particular discharge that is elevating the 1,4-dioxane levels in the river. In contrast, some of the other discharges led to, no change, no measurable change in the 1,4-dioxane concentration. So there are particular places where this chemical is coming from. So we've been talking with DEQ for a long time about this, and there has been pressure on some of the known dischargers to reduce or eliminate the discharges. And when we look at 1,4-dioxane levels in the Fayetteville water intake over the years, starting from, this says 2014 here, right? So if we track from 2014 down to now, I put the average concentration for each year, so you can see that there is a downward trend as a result of source control. So that is really good news, because 1,4-dioxane is very difficult to actually remove from drinking water. But I looked at data yesterday and found something a little bit troubling. I've been tracking mostly the Fayetteville location, the more upstream location, because all of the sources that we knew up to this point have been sources that were located in the Haw River watershed and the Deep River watershed. So I compared Fayetteville in orange to CFPUA in blue, and when we look at 2018, 2019 through 2020, the blue and the orange dots track pretty well, right? So that suggests that there was not much change between Fayetteville and Wilmington. But there's something happening here in 2021 where the levels in Wilmington at the intake are now higher than they are in Fayetteville, which suggests somewhere between Fayetteville and Wilmington's intake there is a new source of 1,4-dioxane. So I shared this with CFPUA and PwC and DEQ yesterday, and I guess it'll be looked at. In terms of what does this mean for Wilmington drinking water, ozonation, which is part of the drinking water treatment plant's treatment process, is actually able to oxidize about 2/3 of the 1,4-dioxane that's coming into the plant. So you can see in light blue the raw water, and in dark blue the finished drinking water. And so if you look at 1,4-dioxane levels in the finished drinking water over the last few years, there was a downward trend from 2019 to 2020, but then in the last 2 years it's going up again. These average levels, New York State is currently the only state in the US that has a drinking water standard for 1,4-dioxane at 1 microgram per liter. So if you lived in New York, the Wilmington levels would still pass the standard. But there's clearly some peaks here that look a bit worrisome. The other thing is, besides Wilmington, the intake serves Brunswick County and Pender County, and neither Brunswick nor Pender County have ozone as part of their treatment process. So the Brunswick County and Pender County folks are drinking the light blue stuff, and for the last year, 2022, the average 1,4-dioxane concentration was just under 2 micrograms per liter, so it would not meet the New York standard. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about bromide. Bromide is a little bit more difficult to explain because bromide in and of itself is not harmful to human health. But when we disinfect water to kill bacteria and viruses, we form what is called disinfection byproducts. And this slide got garbled up a lot, so I apologize for that. Must be a Mac Windows thing. Basically what happens is when we add chlorine to water, this chlorine can react with bromide to form hyperbromous acid, and then the chlorine and bromine basically react with natural organic matter in the water. So natural organic matter, I always like to explain, well, if you go on a boat ride on the Cape Fear River, stand in front of the boat and see how the water, when the boat cuts through the water, the water looks like sweet tea a little bit, right? So that brownish color is natural organic matter that basically comes from the soil, it comes from leaves that decay, and so on. So it's not in and of itself harmful, but when we disinfect water that has this natural organic matter in it, we form organic compounds that contain chlorine and bromine. And these compounds are regulated, so the water treatment plant makes sure that we stay below the limits for these chemicals. So, but why is bromide important then? So we did a study in 2013 surveying bromide levels across the state of North Carolina, and like with almost everything else, the Cape Fear River had the biggest triangles here, where the size of the triangle is proportional to how much bromide is in the water. And then when we look at these disinfection byproducts that were measured by the drinking water plants at these same locations, we look at how much is chlorinated, so that would be the yellow part of the pie, and how much is brominated, which is the red part of the pie. And so you can see that where the triangles are big, the pies are mostly red, right? So we form more brominated byproducts rather than the chlorinated byproducts. So why is that important? So we conducted a study with a colleague of mine, Susan Richardson, at the University of South Carolina, where we tracked disinfection byproducts, 70 different ones. And we know a lot about the toxicity of these disinfection byproducts, so we could calculate the toxicity of the byproducts that were generated when we chlorinated the water for disinfection purposes. And so when you look at the calculated toxicity for a low bromide water, this is sort of a typical level in North Carolina, versus a higher bromide water, this is a level that's pretty typical in the Cape Fear River. The toxicity associated with the byproducts that are generated increases. That's true for cytotoxicity, so toxicity to the cells, as well as genotoxicity, so toxicity to our genetic material. So as bromide goes up, the toxicity of the byproducts that are formed goes up. When we treat the water with activated carbon, especially for the water with higher bromide levels, we're able to decrease that toxicity again dramatically. So that's a good thing. And so as many of you perhaps know, the CFPUA actually installed granular activated carbon filters at the Sweeney Water Treatment Plant. So and the purpose for installing the GAC was for PFAS removal. But a big side benefit is that GAC also lowers the toxicity of the water as it relates to disinfection byproducts. So we've been, these are some data from CFPUA looking at disinfection byproducts. So there are two types that are regulated. This blue class is called trihalomethanes. The red is haloacetic acids. You can see that there's a decreasing trend here in the 2014 to 2016 time frame, especially for the trihalomethanes. But then here, just in October of last year, when the granular activated carbon adsorbers went online, you see a huge drop in disinfection byproduct levels. So this is a huge side benefit of the activated carbon treatment, and especially in light of the fact that bromide levels in the source water are elevated. So there are really then two pieces of good news in the end for people living in Wilmington right now. A, the GAC filters are removing PFAS very well, but B, they're also very good in controlling these disinfection byproducts. And I should say, since we're talking about long-term trends, the bromide source, to the best of my knowledge, there's a single one way upstream in the Cape Fear River. I actually don't know what that source is. but it has not been addressed. When we look at mass flows of bromide in the river over the last 10 years, it's basically flat. So that is still something important to also deal with. So in the end, the take-home message or messages, unregulated contaminants impact the drinking water source for about a million people living in the Cape Fear River watershed. 1,4-dioxane is oxidized by ozone, so that applies for the Sweeney plant here in Wilmington. GAC absorption effectively controls PFAS and these disinfection byproducts. But in the end, source control is key. So when we look at inputs into the watershed, one important PFAS source has been addressed to a large extent, not completely, but that meant just by addressing the source, PFAS levels in the Wilmington area have dropped by over 99% without any treatment. But there are many other sources of PFAS in the watershed that still require attention. Some 1,4-dioxane sources have been eliminated, but like I just showed you, there's a new one that popped up between Fayetteville and Wilmington. And then finally, the bromide source continues to impact the watershed. So with that, I guess Colleen and I are happy to answer questions.
Thank you. My name is Stan Weinrich. I have a question for each of you, if I may. Dr. Knappe, you didn't mention anything about the impact of the activated carbon treatment at Sweeney on 1,4-dioxane. Does it have any positive impact in removing it?
It does not. So 1,4-dioxane is very difficult to absorb to activate carbon. So within a week or two, the carbon is exhausted in terms of its ability to remove 1,4-dioxane. So the ozonation is really what's doing the work at the Sweeney plant, and it basically gets rid of about 2/3 of the 1,4-dioxane. So Brunswick County with reverse osmosis will be able to remove probably somewhat more 1,4-dioxane, but even reverse osmosis isn't 100%, doesn't provide a complete barrier against 1,4-dioxane, so there may be still a small percentage that might make it through the reverse osmosis membrane.
Thank you.
But the levels will be extremely low by that point.
Okay. Colleen, one for you, if I may. You talked about long-term impact of fecal contamination in the river. We know that major storm events and hurricanes significantly increase that amount for a short period of time. Is that affected, is your data affected by that, or is your timing such that it's not impacted by these major storm events?
Great question. Yeah, we see in the data that there is those major storms like Florence. We saw big increases in everything in the water, so we do see that increase as well. It's flushing the things out, waste that's in there. But those sorts of storms, they will impact the trends over time, so we didn't remove those storm events for the trends. Those are kept in there because that shows how it increases over time for everything. So yeah, we see it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Julia, and I've got a chemically ignorant question for you. For the fluoroethers or any of the PFAS, PFOs, these man-made, manufactured ingredients, do they play together once they're in the water? Do they make brand new things that we don't know or aren't measuring?
That's a great question. So these chemicals are actually very non-reactive, so they don't play together in the water. But maybe a somewhat related question that is important is, do they have synergistic effects in terms of toxicity in our bodies? So if we have multiple different ones in our bodies, how does that compare to understanding the toxicity of each one individually? but they don't react in the types that I've been talking about. There are some others that are called precursors that can react, but that means really they just fall apart to something that no longer reacts. But they don't form larger things in the water.
I have a question. Thank you both for your great presentations. My name's Phil Preet, and for you, Dr. Knappe, can you, for me it was totally counterintuitive why the raw water had lower levels of the PFAS than the treated water. Can you explain that for somebody that's ignorant on this?
Yeah,
Thank
no,
you.
that's a great observation. So the difference was somewhat small, so on the order of about 20%. Part of that can be just simply variability in some of the analytical measurements, especially since we didn't have some of the, well, like we add certain chemicals to our sample to correct for variability, but we didn't have those chemicals available for some of the newer fluor ethers that we found at the time. But I think more importantly, the reason why there was a difference, most likely that was actually real, is that we collected those two samples within a matter of a couple of minutes, but the finished water is almost a day older than the raw water. And the river flow changed during that time. There was a storm, and as a result, the flow increased, and so that, let me see, was it, so the raw water was lower than the finished water. So actually the river flow was decreasing, and so there was less dilution for the sample that was collected with the lower flow. So it's always tricky when you collect surface water samples because the concentration that you get is a function of the flow in the river and also what was being put in at a particular point in time upstream, and both of these things vary, and so it's very difficult to just directly compare those and say, you know, something got added during treatment, which was not the case. Yeah.
Okay, maybe one more question before the break.
Thank you. I was just wondering, you said that Sweeney Water Plant has the activated carbon and the ozone, but what about the other water plants in the area? Are they doing anything about it? And then those of us that have well water, like how are we supposed to address all of the PFAS?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Good question. So you know, at Lock and Dam 1, water goes to the Sweeney plant, to the Brunswick County's Northwest plant, and to the Pender County plant. So Brunswick County currently has just conventional treatment, but they're building a reverse osmosis plant that will go online in another year. And you know, that reverse osmosis plant will take out pretty much everything, the PFAS, pretty much all of the 1,4-dioxane minus maybe 10% or so. Very good in removing also these disinfection byproduct precursors and bromide. So, you know, in another year, Brunswick County will also be in a very good spot. Pender County has granular activated carbon, so there will be some PFAS removal. I don't fully understand on what basis they change out their activated carbon right now, so that would be an important question, I think, for people in Pender County to also push for, you know, what level of PFAS will really trigger a change out of the activated carbon so that you get new carbon in that is effective again in removing the PFAS. So private wells, if your private well is contaminated with PFAS, you know, you will likely be eligible under the consent order to obtain a whole house filter or under sink reverse osmosis filters if your well contains the compounds that are associated with chemours. So that would be, so I'm happy to talk with you. There's a website that provides information of how one can contact, chemours to obtain water filters as a result of the PFAS contamination of a private well. So the options are basically whole house granular activated carbon filter or under sink reverse osmosis filter.
So my question is, they're filtering out these chemical compounds, and where do they then go after they change out the filters or separate them from the drinking water? How are they being destroyed? Are they being stored?
Mm-hmm. Excellent question. So for the granular activated carbon that basically is used at Sweeney, at the Sweeney Water Treatment Plant here in Wilmington, it gets thermally reactivated so that the carbon gets actually taken to a facility near Buffalo, New York by truck. All the adsorbed material is essentially burned up there, and it's done under controlled conditions so that the activated carbon does not get burned up and can be reused. So then trucks bring that reactivated carbon back to Sweeney and it gets reused. So then there's questions about, is this thermal reactivation, can this be done safely? That's still a research question. Our lab is actually involved in doing some studies related to that. But my best estimate is that it can be done safely because in the past, when activated carbon was used to remove a lot of chlorinated chemicals, there was a lot of concern about a pollutant called dioxin, not 1,4-dioxane, but dioxins that are very toxic. And so there's air pollution control equipment on those facilities to destroy these dioxins. It needs to be, we need the data to really prove that this can be done safely, but I'm fairly certain that it can be done safely. So that leaves reverse osmosis concentrate. In this case, for Brunswick County, the reverse osmosis concentrate is returned back to the river. So that always creates a lot of consternation at first, but I always have to tell you that before reverse osmosis treatment, all those PFAS went with the wastewater, through the wastewater treatment plant back to the river too. So in that sense, nothing is really that different. And if one would spend a lot of effort on removing the PFAS from the reverse osmosis concentrate, I would say that money could be spent much more effectively treating a source, because I cannot measure the difference between the Cape Fear River with and without the reverse osmosis concentrate. But if we deal with a source, I can actually measure the difference. So it's not very satisfying to put it back in the river, but the focus really needs to be on the important sources.
Thank you, Detlef and Colleen. And that was a really great comment to end on. We have to pay attention to the sources. That's what we're here about. One brief comment before we break. I want to recognize County Commissioner Rob Zappel, who has showed up. He's along the wall there.